Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Chase, Principal Strategist here at JumpCloud. And with us today, we have Nathan McAfee, Senior Analyst for the Enterprise Strategy Group. And in today's discussion, we'll be looking through the findings of the economic analysis that the Enterprise Strategy Group did, and a couple different areas that we'll be discussing. First, the challenges that businesses face in providing identity access management in our current landscape, as well as the validation process that the ESG group went through. And then finally, some of the economic benefits of leveraging JumpCloud during some of those studies, and some of those actually had some pretty interesting findings. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Nathan and describe a little bit more.
Thanks, Chase. So I'm an economic analyst. What I do is I look at the impact of change. So we try to figure out, what is the pain in a current situation that would drive somebody to change, or what's the pull in a new capability. So in this case, we specifically looked at JumpCloud. As part of it, we do customer interviews. So we've got Enterprise Strategy Group, or ESG, you'll hear me say throughout the short as we talk. We have analysts across just about every industry. I took the information that we have, a lot of research, talked to a bunch of the analysts, and then we sat down and we talked to customers that have moved to JumpCloud. And again, it was around looking at their pain or their pull. We asked them about their before states. We asked them, now that you're with JumpCloud, how has it changed the way you do business? How has it changed, both your business and your IT goals? Then we created a financial model, and we came up with a sample organization, and we ran through the different benefits, and the end result was to be able to put a number on the change. So customers that move to JumpCloud, what type of economic impact can they expect?
That's amazing. And especially walking through all the different pieces of that, I'm excited to kind of unpack that, because you've actually found it in kind of several different categories, and not only in terms of the economic value, but then also some other surprising findings.
Yeah, well, we start off with the pain. So we try to figure out what are the challenges you're incurring. And across the board, the number one was complexity, or really the unknown because of complexity. Mm-hmm. I talked to customers that different types. A few that I talked to were, we were doing everything manually. We had some manual processes to manage all of our different identities, and we just outgrew it. And it got to the point where everything was too complex because we had so many identities across so many things. It was very time consuming. And it all led to the biggest fear was we really just didn't have a clue. If people didn't fit into our very certain mold, they were virtually unmanaged. Mm-hmm. With that, security threats, but I didn't have anybody say, everybody said we were scared. Every single person I talked to said since they've been with JumpCloud, they're able to go to their senior leaders and say, we are more secure. We are better. We have a better security posture. But as I was talking through challenges, each of them said, we just weren't sure. We know it's a scary world out there, but we couldn't tell where we were, especially the ones that had blended end user computing bases, and all types of different clients and devices. I talked to a lot of people about costs, and we'll talk a bit about costs, but it wasn't just what is the amount I'm paying out every month. So much around cost was we really didn't have a clue how much that it cost. We knew we just kept pouring money, but in the end, we couldn't really point to something and say, the more I put in, the more I get out. Or there was just ambiguity. And then something you'll hear me talk about quite a few times, the concept of technical debt came out over and over and over. And that was how much of their effort and current budget was just squandered, was thrown away because they were paying the price of decisions made in the past. That everything that they did was either cumbersome or more expensive because they didn't have a long-term plan. But technical debt really came out over and over. Then I talked to a few customers that had, and were specific compliance industries. And again, that just is back to the shrug your shoulders hope of, I hope we're good enough. They just weren't able to put together the right term, a firm governance plan to make sure they were in compliance, and then how much it cost them to try to prove that they were in compliance with whatever regulations that they had. And I did talk to a few different industries that were very compliance based, and heard a lot of pain about that. So,
Yeah.
in your customers that you talk to, Chase, I just talked to a small subset of your customer base. Anything here that you look at and say, yeah, I don't quite get it, or anything should be added to this list as some of the big pain points that your customers are seeing?
I think it's interesting that you're presenting kind of all three, 6 of these different scenarios. And within that, I see kind of a bunch of intertwining themes, right? And so when you're thinking about, well, I have increased complexity because part of it is I don't know. I'm not sure what access I might have into, or if is it too much access or not enough to get their jobs done. And then that not knowing kind of leads to some of these other pieces where, I'm not sure if I'm able to meet my compliance goals, or I know that there's some unknown security threat, but because I don't have all these different areas managed, well, then I got to dive into it. Oh, then that actually starts to surface some of those higher costs and technical debt. And so it's kind of this discovery process, and they're all kind of intertwined between that. And so we often see a couple of these pieces start to come up a little bit more. And it's interesting that you brought up technical debt, because I think every organization has some debt, right? And there's always some pieces that either functionally or kind of process-wise, we want to make sure it's up to snuff. But really what we also find is it's viewed within this lens of, now I don't have the flexibility, right? I can't go after this business goal, or I don't have enough agility within the organization because now I have to fix this thing. It has now kind of come up to bear of what this looks like. And then you get a better sense of cost. So like, do you even have people to run with this thing? Do we need to hire other people? Are we have duplicate efforts, right? Are there some overlapping technologies that now is the time that we can start to reduce that? And so all of these themes pop up within our customer base, I'd say, more frequently, but you also see it within different contexts of what they're trying to achieve, both strategically as well as from a security perspective.
Yeah, and boy, something you said that really hit was the I just don't know. I had one customer. I had a long list of quotes. Some of them I was able to put into the paper, the end deliverable, but so many I just didn't have space for. But somebody told me I was like a hamster on a wheel. I just didn't know. All I knew is I had to do all these things to keep us going. But just how limiting that was. And that really falls into when we look at the 3 biggest areas. Sorry, I have to stop for a second. So when we look at the 3 benefit areas that came out, so improved cost effectiveness, and we'll talk about each of these in detail, business agility, which you were just getting into, and improved security posture and governance, which goes through and really addresses a lot of those challenges. So if we look at the first one in the cost effectiveness, each person that I talked to said our costs are lower with JumpCloud than what we think they were in the past. And why I say when they think they were, some were very, very labor intensive. And those are the ones that tried to manually keep and ended up with multiple different identities. Some were using traditional, directory access and management systems, and they were telling me how expensive those people were. They were sort of locked into using these systems and these people, and it just limited them. The number between 40 and 60%, I heard 40 was the lower. I heard a lot of people tell me we think our costs were lowered more than 60, but I just tried to keep everything in a conservative range. The biggest thing I heard about cost is understanding the cause and effect of what they were going to sell or what they were spending, because now their costs were predictable, and they knew that as their needs went up, their costs would scale in a linear fashion instead of these big stair steps they were incurring in the past. Also, I talked to one organization, and they would not only expand quickly through acquisition, and we'll really talk about that when we hit to with agility, but they would also sell a lot of parts of their business. They were constantly going up and down and up and down, and they said we just couldn't do that with our old systems. it slowed us down. Our time to value was slower, and we were just limited on our ability to scale down. And that's something that really was shining with JumpCloud. You know, the simple things to look at, just elimination of infrastructure, how easy it is to do everything in the cloud. And somebody really stepped me through. You know, most of the people I talked to went through some type of chaotic event as they were shifting in COVID. And I had somebody tell me, now I went from supporting 5 locations to now I'm supporting almost 3,000 locations because everybody is now their own location.
Yeah.
And just how enabling JumpCloud was for that. And I was push back to you for a second before we talk about the rest of these. Does that really resonate? How often do you hear that story? Because I heard it from one person I interviewed, but when he talked about it, he got so passionate about how it just took away his pain.
Yeah, and especially on the cost perspective. And so, because we'll typically think about that in terms of, well, there's hard costs. And so are you able to remove existing technologies or kind of point solutions and implement a JumpCloud platform? So that way you're reducing kind of all those different areas. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of soft costs in terms of, well, now there's manual work involved. I now have to learn across 5 or 6 different tools. I have to be certified in there, and making sure that too, once you have all those set up, that they're all interconnected and they're talking to each other. So even if you have it all wired up, if some event happens, or like you said, if you're increasing or decreasing your workforce dramatically or kind of seasonally, that creates a lot of mayhem in terms of, great, now we need to staff up or staff down just to handle the extra admin around that. And then your other point in terms of, you know, thinking about each person in terms of their own office, right? So I happen to be in our office today, but I have multiple offices. It changes throughout the day. And so this whole mentality about reducing infrastructure, it's this mentality of having infrastructure around kind of where the work is. And we certainly saw that through COVID, and even more business changes that are happening, where we've even found within our own research that about half of organizations are coming into the office, but then the other half are either fully remote or hybrid, or like I said, have multiple offices through that day. And so as you start to break down that 4-walled structure, what is truly the infrastructure needed to allow us to get work done, making sure that you have your identity and access, and also that security posture running through that, to making sure that, 1, you're successful, but then 2, you could have 3,000, 5,000 different kind of mini offices. How do you make sure that your approach to that security also allows you to scale, and it's not being inhibited every time that you're increasing or decreasing your workforce?
Yeah. And it accelerated onboarding. As I went into it, you know, I knew I was going to quantify the value of having somebody, a new employee, enabled quicker. Mm-hmm. What I didn't expect, and came out in a couple of conversations, was how many people leave within the first few weeks of joining an organization. And I tried to get an analyst number to put in the paper, but I couldn't get something I could, you know, stamp the ESG name on. But I heard from multiple people that in the past, we would hire somebody, we were excited about them. By the time we got them enabled, they had been sitting there surfing job sites. And one person told me, we lost almost 20% of our new hires. And they specifically said with JumpCloud, they were able to engage and enable their new employees quicker. So it was just a benefit that was called out to me, but then if I can't quantify it, I don't include it in the paper. But I wanted to mention that because it really jumped out of, hey, we're able to engage people quicker, and then we keep our new hire employees. So that's something that I wanted to definitely mention, because you know, I'm getting excited about it, and the people that told me about it were really, they were telling me this matters.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting approach, right? Because we now have, you know, a combination of, hey, there's a strong job market, and so there's a lot less barriers to switch organizations than there ever has been before, especially from kind of the employee standpoint. But from the employer and kind of the admin and kind of the entire people team staff to making sure that employees are successful, there's still the same amount, if not more, kind of infrastructure and other pieces that you want to make sure that is enabled. And what we found too is the faster that you can enable employees, the faster that you can give access to that, especially in remote contacts where you might not be even meeting face to face with your manager or kind of leadership team or what have you, making sure that those folks have access right away and the right level of access, let's be clear, and that has been pre-scoped, but it has that element of trust. Whereas you used to have onboarding where it'd say, okay, great, we'll kind of sit through a couple weeks, as you mentioned, and then by the end of that time, you're like, well, I haven't really done anything. I'll go find another organization that values me. But if you're able to provide that access, and through that kind of, it's a pseudo trust, right? And say, hey, we're granting you keys to the castle of your own castle, of your own four walls there, but making sure that they are set up for success from the beginning. It increases that trust, it increases that onboarding experience, and hopefully, right, that the likelihood of retention through those employees by making sure that they're well taken care of from their very first day.
Yeah. Now it bleeds over into our security conversation, which we'll have in a minute, but also immediate offboarding was called out again and again as an ability that really brought some value. I pulled up some security statistics, and I couldn't get a number that says the risk of an off-boarded employee still having access to company resources. I know it's there, but I couldn't get it down to a specific number, so I didn't include it. But that was called out as a pretty strong ability of JumpCloud also, to when they start, I give them immediate access, and when they're done, I immediately take away all company access, and that's something that truly matters.
It is. We were actually looking with, I believe it was Code 42. They came out with a statistic in terms of, I think it was 62%, something like that, where employees kind of leave and they still maintain some level of access, or they've taken some of that documentation with them. And I like to see the world as half full and say, hey, not everyone is nefarious out there. And it's like, hey, I did a really good job on a presentation, or there's some sort of strategic model I came up with that I feel proud of. But again, everything that has been a part of that organization is now part of that organization's IP, whether you like it or not. And so having that ability for anyone, regardless of they're great or not so great, to enter and exit an organization securely, and knowing that those access points have been shut down as it's related to protecting the organization. Because as we mentioned, a lot of organizations also increase and decrease their workforce pretty dramatically, and that becomes harder to see, well, who had access to what at what time, and how do we make sure that those guardrails are put in place from the beginning to then also help them scale in the future.
Yeah. Something you just said really rolls into the next one. I talked to one company, and because of JumpCloud, they are able to better harness gig economy. They're able to do opportunities that they wouldn't in the past, because they can immediately enable somebody, control their access completely, and then immediately take it away. Every company that I talked to said, because of the abilities or capabilities of JumpCloud, what it allows us to do, we have increased our revenue. And I had some numbers that were very high. And the paper always scale things down quite a bit. But if you look at just a 0.5% on revenue, which every person that I talked to said their increased revenue was multiple times that, it makes the cost of JumpCloud and the change a no-brainer. But we talked about cost and how do we lower cost, one side of the equation, but the equation, or the part that really started to shine, is when you look at, hey, I'm hitting both sides. I'm now increasing my revenue because I can do business differently.
Interesting. And that's right, because we typically look at it's cost reduction. Hey, we're going to consolidate multiple different tools and technologies into a platform, and that then provides security benefits, the ability to kind of onboard and offboard faster. But the relationship to revenues is kind of new. I'd say not uncharted territory, but it's an interesting benefit that I think most organizations don't consider when they're thinking about implementing these types of technologies strategically, and kind of the impact that it can have on, maybe it's a new onboarded employee that is that much more productive and then able to increase revenue there. But then also, what are some of the other areas that you've seen in terms of having the ability to leverage revenue in a strategic way?
Yeah. One is, so many people told me, we now have a better relationship with our business units. In the past, we were always saying no, 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 because we couldn't control, access. Now that we can control it, we enable business. So I had quite a few conversations of how now we're working with our business to say, what do you need? And we're now enabling them instead of, sort of holding them back in the past. Also, you look at, somebody told me a great quote, and I don't remember if I used it in the paper or not, but they said, I could teach my boss how to use JumpCloud. So when they look at taking people from below the line activities, from sitting there, hey, I'm tracking, access across multiple different, spreadsheets or whatever system they had, and shifting it to above the line activities where now I'm supporting and helping drive business. Those were the two biggest stories. I've simplified things, and now I'm working with my business units to figure out, what do you need? How do we support it? Instead of how do I protect everything, and become somewhat of a barrier instead of an enabler is probably the best way to put it.
So it's more almost hitting at the macro, I'd say processes of an organization, because then they're able to drive it, but it's also unlocking that business agility and kind of having a little bit more flexibility in terms of, hey, I can say yes to these things because I also know now it's in my environment. I know what people can have access to, and making sure that those friction points along even inter-team communications and different business units, those are happening a little bit more fluidly now.
Yeah. And then reduce technical debt. I'll say that over and over. I recently did a paper that's posted up on the ESG site, and the average company, about 40% of current IT budgets are squandered, is the best word for it, are wasted servicing decisions of the past. And when you look at new project money for IT in general, that's about 10% of your new project budget, again, is squandered, is handed off. And each person I talked to told me how, the JumpCloud was able to simplify, to remove complexity, to give them assurance. A lot of the things that lead to technical debt are eliminated. So it to make sure that I don't think we could oversell that, because it really, it shined. And again, when somebody says my boss is able to do it, always bad to talk bad about bosses, but going into agility, which is something you mentioned a second ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the core of it was the visibility. I had people tell me that we had okay access management for our Windows-based computers. Our Macs were somewhat self-managed. I heard so many stories of that where, and then if you start throwing in variants of Linux, there were companies that were just operating on best hope.
Mm-hmm.
And the immediate visibility they had into their entire system when they went to JumpCloud. And I also heard great stories about how quickly the deployment and this visibility, came to these new customers, and just that being the core of understanding. Then I also had a lot of talks about, governance, which we'll jump into in a second. But I heard so many good things about the process of moving to JumpCloud help us set best practices. It's not just the product; it is the mindset. And they really had great things to talk about the JumpCloud team, helping them understand how to migrate in a way where you have the mindset of governance, and that all came from visibility, understanding what you had, what assets you had, and to make sure you had some type of consistency across all the assets that needed the same type of access. So I rambled a bit, but wondering if that rang a bell or any on your side, Jace.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the areas too, kind of coming back to briefly on technical debt, typically the way that I like to think about it is it's not anyone's fault. It's just there's different layers of processes that are needed across a business at different times. And then over time, well, you start to have a little bit more layers, and it's hard to break free of that. And so being able to work with JumpCloud and be able to kind of make sure that you're able to untangle some of those different things kind of through that guided process, but then also meeting people where they are. And so not everyone's working on the same types of laptops, desktops, OSs, and even differences in between. I'm a Mac person, so if I went to a Windows tomorrow, it'd take a long time to get me back up to speed. But you see this across not only different individuals, but different departments and even different geographies as well. And so, for example, variations of Linux are much more popular, I'd say, outside of the United States because it's a little bit cheaper to maintain, kind of also deploy. But then now, if you are running within different geographies and different people and locations, well, you lose a lot of that visibility. And so being able to manage and understand just, hey, what is out there in my ecosystem, where are these things happening? Because for us, we truly feel that, a majority of, I'd say, IP-driven strategic value work is happening on these laptops that we're talking on today. And making sure that you have that type of visibility allows an organization to, well, understand just where the baseline is, right? And so how much technical debt do I have in order to achieve my strategic goals? And then that allows kind of this fruition to kind of take place and understand truly what's possible within an organization.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about integrations? I heard a few specific stories, but I don't know if they were specific to those customers. But can you tell me about your integration environment as a whole?
Absolutely. Well, we typically like to make sure that, one, we want to integrate within everything within your existing stack that's possible. So again, making sure that that migration is seamless and fluid. And coming back to earlier when we were talking about onboarding and offboarding scenarios, so we have several different integrations into Google Workspace, Microsoft 365, but then also many different HRS providers. So that way, as soon as an identity is created, regardless of what system it's in, you now have visibility across the line to say, okay, is this person joining? What data are they joining? Okay, what machines do they need? What level of access do they need? So that way, again, coming back to that day one value of making sure that employees are there, engaged, and have the right level of access, all that is driven through integrations. And the other piece I'd like to say is we also set organizations up for success for the future as well. And so all of our integrations are leveraging I'd say standard protocols and other elements, so that way it provides that flexibility in the future. So if you think about features like single sign-on, right? It's a gated access point into applications that are very core to organizations, whether it's infrastructure and DevOps and GitHub, all the way into revenue management and things in Salesforce, communication bases, all those different areas you can start to think about. But we're leveraging protocols to provision those users, so SAML 2.0, SCIM, as well as OpenID Connect. And then we also have other areas in terms of LDAP and Radius for network authentication. So that way, even no matter where you are in your journey, we can meet you where you're at, leveraging those protocols and standard areas, and then bring it into modern integrations to truly provide organizations that flexibility and maneuverability. So that way, it's not a set it and forget it, because again, you will evolve. There'll be new technologies. There might be spatial computing headsets that we have to worry about in the future, like all those different areas. So making sure that you have a solid foundation to then absorb those strategic technologies that organizations need to compete and go beyond here in 2023 and even further.
Got it. Then accelerated change. A couple of companies I talked to, again, that they were able to harness the gig economy, and they called it game changing. It changed their business, but the ability to not only scale up but scale down was called out by a few. Do you have experience in traditional, access and directory management? Can you compare JumpCloud's ability to scale up and down to something you've seen?
And it comes down to, I think, the type of acceleration, the speed, because typically most people think, oh, I will forecast this growth. I will forecast kind of all these different areas. And then you start to build up. In traditional models, then you're stacking it like a staircase, and people don't think about the slide on the other side and say, okay, well, now we need to go back down. How do we do that? And you can't just take another staircase approach, whether that is in, purchasing SKU base and kind of other infrastructure that's needed to scale up, and leveraging, a cloud-based model that allows you to do that so much quicker. But not only on just the infrastructure side, but then also in the change management side, because everything is also integrated in other pieces. You don't have to create these 500 manual steps to then kind of go and support 500, 600 people as kind of all those different areas, you're able to set those processes up. And so and again, leveraging those integrations. So that way, as the business is augmenting itself, your IT stack and your performance and your security around that is also changing with it. So making sure that all those baselines are happening, because if you have a lot of people leaving the organization a lot of times, again, as we mentioned, that's a big gaping security hole, because you're not quite sure who might have access to what and other pieces. So not only are you tracking that down, but then you're also trying to get rid of things that you don't need anymore, and then kind of resetting expectations with everyone's existing. And so there's a lot that's going on, and it's very dynamic. And so being able to have something that supports that flexibility in that model without, building up brick by brick and then building it back down again, makes it a lot easier for organizations to adopt that model.
Yeah. Also with this, and it blends or bleeds right back into the increased revenue. I had one company that did a lot of acquisitions, and they told me that their assimilation time, or really their time to value, was cut in half. The time it took to get the new company set up and running and coming together. And I was unable to get them to the point of us putting a number on it. But it really stood out if you're in the type of organization where you do a lot of acquisitions. Just the ability to immediately get access levels across, resources on both sides and bring them together. And this was taking it from months down to days. I mean, it was truly substantial, and the ability just to get the business flowing on both sides.
And it's an interesting piece, because I think, in certain acquisitions, you can treat them like siblings, right? Because it's got my stuff, and then I have this company that has their stuff. And even from a cultural perspective, it's those small tells, right? It could be different ways that you access resources. It could be different pieces of information within that. And you have that type of mentality. So even for acquisitions to be successful, you want to make sure that it's no longer that's their stuff and my stuff. It's our stuff. And so the faster that you can integrate and get people on similar systems, it's those small things, whether it's, my emails run this way, or I have access to those other areas. Again, people are thinking about access as a pseudonym for trust within a modern organization, because you can't be there next to the same person, not quite sure what they said, or some of those areas. And it's all those other small tells. And so if you're able to do that from an infrastructure and security guide, making sure that everyone's kind of operating from the same place, it helps that cohesion so much better.
Absolutely. Then if we look at our third improved security postures, we've talked about a few of them, but what really was called out here was not just JumpCloud. It was the process of moving to JumpCloud, the structure that you brought, the guidance that you brought as people migrated was really called out as beneficial. I had one really tell me stories about just the concept of zero trust, and how can you ever take a stamp and say we're here, but that JumpCloud was a cornerstone to really help them go towards zero trust, to look at it and to understand what was involved.
It's an interesting piece, because I think there's zero trust in general. There's a lot of elements included. It is a pathway, it's a methodology, it's kind of a way of thinking, and all those different areas. But when you start to break it down in a little bit, it feels very large and daunting, because it even feels kind of has like enterprisey roots. And so it's like, well, if I have a small medium business, like how can I be as secure, kind of adopt those types of mentalities? Like, do I just need to wait and grow and have enough funding and budget in order to do all these things? But when you're able to leverage a platform like JumpCloud, one, you have visibility into, well, what is your trust posture today? Like, do you trust everyone? Is it, are there other areas? And then you're starting to layer in smaller concepts of zero trust, where it looks like conditional access policies, right? And so are you able to get into, our AWS infrastructure just willy-nilly, or what are the safeguards that we need to think about in terms of an organization? And that's often an interesting exercise just for organizations to take on and say, where are we at today? Where should we? And then what are some of the simple ways that we can start to think about putting up not necessarily roadblocks, but making sure that there are substantial checkpoints and ones that don't get in the way. So like, is there somewhere we can have MFA? Great. Could we make that even easier? Could we leverage biometrics or push MFA or other areas? So that way we're achieving those security outcomes, but we're also not getting in the way of our own agility and flexibility that, end workers are trying to get through on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Again, back to the increased visibility, something that really helped customers harden their security posture was being able to identify and eliminate shadow IT. I heard a couple stories of, hey, since once we went to JumpCloud and we could see, all the different assets, we realized there's a lot of stuff on our environment that we didn't know were there and shouldn't be there. So it went into saving costs. They eliminated a lot of redundant and shadow systems, and it definitely helped with security posture. Just making sure that you can go back to your leaders and say we are secure. And one of the simplest quotes that I got in this is somebody told me, "We sleep better at night because of JumpCloud." So it and that it's about as simple as it can get. But they said we're able to assure our leaders and we sleep better.
That's great that it's able to provide, I'd say that level of not only device security, but then also psychological in terms of making sure that there's that ability, and again, that peace of mind. So they say, I have the ability to see what's happening on the device, making sure that it's also secure. And then I think even coming back to your previous point where there are a lot of different elements where you can remove shadow IT, and even thinking about the business agility and the communication structures that we talked about, it's also saying yes a little bit more, right? And once you start to turn that tide a little bit and people say, well, actually, if I ask in my request to receive, or I at least have better communication, I'm more likely to approach our IT and security team first instead of, well, I'll just download this thing. I'm not sure if I can get around it, or kind of whatever that might be in order to get my job done. Now it's much more of a collaborative approach and saying, hey, can we implement this for me and my team, and here's why. And on the opposite side of saying, well, yes, we have that visibility, and depending on what budgets are or other pieces, but you're able to say yes more often, and it actually builds that trust between those teams instead of having, I'd say, current animosity or just kind of friction points of, well, they're just going to get in the way and slow me down anyway, right? And kind of move from there.
And the last point on here, reduction in human-based errors. There were a lot of different stories there. And the simple one is somebody didn't have access they should, cost them a little bit of downtime, cost us a ticket, cost us some admin time. That was the simple part of it. But the stories of, my goodness, people had access to stuff that they shouldn't have had. It put us at risk as far as, IP, as far as compliance, and as far as morale. I heard stories of, employee morale was down because he's supposed to be my peer, or she has access to all that. I mean, the human errors that were eliminated with JumpCloud really stood out as a cost benefit, as a compliance benefit, and then also as a morale benefit. It people just getting access to what they should was called out as a pretty good benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the biggest faux pas that we typically see in kind of creating that access to is from day one. And so if you don't have the right information, kind of leaning on your HRS partners or your people team to then translate in that to that access, well, there's some mismatches there, right? Is this the Greg S, or is this the Greg E, or is this the Greg K? And what level of access do they need, especially if I'm a growing organization and have a large onboarding class or some other pieces where those tend to fall by the wayside. And so if you're able to rely on secure integrations between some of those other, it helps set up that access from the very beginning, so you could start to avoid some of those gotchas or those oopsies, I'd say, a little bit later, when you start to unravel who has access to what, and again, coming back to a much more visible security baseline.
Got it. So when you look at the economic validation paper, I've gone into each of these areas, broken them down, applied them to an example company, and you can go look at the paper to see all the different details and specific numbers behind them. In talking to our analysts, we were able to strongly recommend that any company that's looking at identity and access management should absolutely consider JumpCloud. For a company that wants to look at it and feel it out, Chase, how do they get started?
Well, it's a great question. And, the best part is that everything that we've talked about, kind of the different tools and technology sets and the ability to kind of have this influence and impact within your organization is actually available for free. So you just go to jumpcloud.com. You can actually sign up and create a brand new tenant. We have all of these features ungated. So as you grow with us beyond 10, then we will grow with you. And again, as we mentioned, kind of start within that migration, understand where you are and kind of your own specific layers of your IT technology stack, but making sure that as you adopt JumpCloud in its various forms and functions, it's also enhancing your current processes and allow you to be much more strategic as you think about your security, IT, and even compliance goals towards the end of the year. So that is the best place for folks to get started, and as well, join the Enterprise Strategy Group for this findings as well as many more in terms of the economic benefit and impacts as you look to change and have your own structures within your own organization.
Well, perfect. So Chase, I really enjoyed visiting with a lot of your customers. I've enjoyed learning more about JumpCloud, and appreciate your time today.
And absolutely, thank you so much. And again, this asset and more is available for download. And thank you again so much for your time, Nathan. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Enjoyed being here. Thank you.
Thanks.
Please subscribe and check out more content from us.